Barbara Moser-Mercer on technology-mediated interpreting. What I'd like to do in my presentation today is introduce you to the interpreting brain, then discuss the cognitive potential and constraints, and then I would like to conclude with how the interpreting brain learns to circumvent constraints, basically conclude on a very optimistic note, that is to say that our brain is plastic and that when we learn a skill and become more efficient and more expert at it, we can actually circumvent certain of its constraints, albeit not all of them. Here you see a very rough introduction to the brain. We have the frontal lobe with the executive functions, responsible also for movement. We have the parietal lobe. It integrates sensory information. We have the occipital lobe, responsible for vision, and the temporal lobe, responsible for hearing, the emotions, and memory. On this slide, you can see some of the results of a long-term research project that we've been carrying out here at the Faculty for Translation and Interpreting on students who acquire skills in simultaneous and consecutive interpreting. We've developed a theoretical approach to how people acquire expertise, and the theoretical approach was based on a long-term experiment that we carried out many years ago, where we tried in a more qualitative way to understand what challenges students face as they acquire simultaneous and consecutive interpreting skills. So based on the qualitative approach, we produced certain research questions, and we looked at some of the research, and quite a bit of the research, the neurocognitive research that has already been carried out in the field of bilingualism, for example, and in the field of expertise development, to see how our qualitative data match up with the quantitative data from those areas. We're finding now in this long-term research that we started 2 years ago, and we're now finished with our data collection. We have followed 3 groups of students, a total of 27 interpreting students, from the first day when they entered our master's program in conference interpreting to the day they took their final exams. We imaged their brains at regular intervals, and we also included functional MRI components. Here you see some of the preliminary results that provide very good evidence of the different regions of the brain that get recruited in 2 somewhat comparable tasks, one of them being interpretation and the other one being shadowing. And there are 2 more tasks, control tasks, shadowing and listening. And we can see that during interpretation, more and to some extent other regions of the brain get recruited and activity develops. Of particular importance to us is, of course, the issue of simultaneity. Interpreting is fascinating to those who listen to it or see interpreters at work, because seemingly interpreters do many things at the same time. They're a bit like jugglers. They are terribly good at multitasking, so it seems, at least on the surface. And when we look at the brain and the images of the brain across the development of that expertise, we can also see that during shadowing, certain areas get recruited but that during interpreting, the brain becomes even more active and more areas get recruited, and those you can see in red. Here is a different view of the brain opened up, and again, you find evidence of the fact that during interpreting, many more areas get recruited in the brain. This is indeed a very encouraging result, because what it tells us is that as learners develop expertise in simultaneous interpreting, their brains change. Literally, their brains are not necessarily rearranged, as some students often will tell us, but the way in which certain regions of the brain respond to tasks is different. Before a student starts to acquire the skill, while the student is acquiring the skill, and once he or she has acquired that skill. I will return to this plasticity, the phenomenon of plasticity of the brain, towards the end of my presentation. Let us look first at the various constraints that operate in simultaneous interpreting, and again, I won't be able to give you a complete overview, but I will mention the most important ones. There's language proficiency. How good are you at the languages that you are working with and between? Your A language, your native language, your B language, the one that you are most proficient in, of the languages other than your mother tongue, and C languages that you work from. This is at least the distinction that we're making in conference interpreting, and I know in other areas of interpreting those distinctions are not necessarily made in exactly the same way. Another constraint that interpreters run into in real-life meetings is the knowledge base. If you picked me out of this recording room now and put me into a conference on financial markets without my having ever taken a look at the agenda, nor having seen the documents that have been distributed to the delegates, I may not necessarily perform at a very high level, despite the fact that I do know a thing or two about the financial markets because I've worked on that topic in other conferences. Nevertheless, my knowledge base is not as developed as it would be if I had known about this assignment earlier on and had had a chance to develop the knowledge base. Another constraint is the level of discourse complexity. Here I speak in an improvised way based on slides that I have developed for the purpose of this presentation. So it's not entirely improvised. Nevertheless, I do not have a script in front of me. I do not read. And I certainly don't have a script that I've worked and reworked and edited and re-edited several times to take out all redundancy and make it as dense as possible. That means the denser the discourse, the more abstract it becomes, and the more difficult it is for an interpreter to interpret that live. So there are constraints. Another constraint is time on task. Indeed, when I come into the booth at 9 o'clock in the morning and I'm well rested, I'm ready to go. Let's say for 30 minutes in simultaneous interpreting. However, if I had an assignment from 9 to 12 in the morning and then found out at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that I would not be assigned until 9 o'clock at night, chances are that I'm not going to go to bed and sleep until 9 o'clock at night. And I will therefore be a little more tired at night, not as well rested as at 9 o'clock in the morning. If, for example, all of a sudden my colleague in the booth were to fall ill from 1 minute to the next and would leave me alone on the task for an hour or two, indeed, that would represent a serious constraint because I would not have a moment to relax. If I had to do many, many meetings in a week, I would not get even an afternoon or a morning off. I would probably feel it on Saturday afternoon. So the constraint with respect to time on task is both one of uninterrupted task performance, one of time of day, and then one that we could label cumulative. How many meetings, how many hours overall have you spent in front of the microphone during the week? Last but certainly not least, and I would say nowadays one of the most serious constraints is speed. Speed can be defined in terms of words uttered per minute, but it could also be defined by the degree of complexity and density of the original speech. And I think the best definition is one that takes both of these parameters into account. I might be speaking slowly, but I might have prepared my material so well that it has become so dense that despite the fact that I don't utter many words a minute, it will still be very difficult for the interpreter to process. Let us look at the consequences of these constraints. So we had language proficiency, and the immediate consequence of language proficiency that is not absolutely perfect would be that we may not understand, we may not comprehend the original as quickly and as accurately as we would if we had a perfect command of those languages. So there's an immediate consequence on comprehension, on production, and ultimately on output speed, because if I have to think about what is being said for quite some time, I'm obviously going to be speaking much more slowly. If I don't know what is being talked about, I haven't had a chance to prepare, this will have an impact on how well I comprehend and ultimately on how fast I will produce my target language rendition. Time on task will also have an influence on comprehension. How quickly am I going to be able to disambiguate meaning, for example? And then ultimately on output speed. The speed of the original will very definitely have an impact on comprehension as well as on production. And if it's a novel work context, and this is ultimately the subject of my presentation today, it will also have an impact on how we comprehend, how well we comprehend, how fast we comprehend, and hence on the quality of our output. Now, why do these constraints have the consequences that they have? If you think back on the brain and on the different areas that get recruited, one of the areas, looking back on the first image that I showed you of the brain, one of the areas is definitely the frontal lobe. This is also the area where we would normally situate executive functions and where we would normally situate working memory. For a long time now, we've understood that simultaneous interpreting, in particular, consecutive interpreting to a large extent as well, but simultaneous interpreting is indeed a process that requires very rapid decision-making, that requires multitasking, manipulating different streams of information more or less simultaneously. You listen to the original, you transfer that into the target language, you utter the target language, all the while you continue to listen to the original, and at any point in time, I would say about 65% of the time, you're going to have to process both the original as well as your own interpretation for the purpose of monitoring. This is why we feel, and at least our theoretical assumptions have all pointed in that direction, that working memory is at the core of the simultaneous interpreting process. And we have posited the hypothesis that individuals with better working memory should also be individuals who are more capable and better at simultaneous interpretation. Not all the evidence is in, and whatever evidence we have available to us today, at least for the field of interpreting, is not necessarily overlapping. It is contradictory to some extent, but to explain that to you would really take me off on a tangent of experimental design in simultaneous interpreting research, and I know I won't have the time for that. What is working memory capacity if we pursue the idea that individuals with better working memory and better working memory capacity would ultimately make better interpreters? Well, there's an operational definition that we could use, and it's very simply the number of items that can be recalled during a complex working memory task that involves simultaneous storage and processing components. Clearly, in simultaneous interpreting, to some extent that also depends on the degree of symmetry between the source and the target language. We have to store information. We cannot process information and all of it immediately. Some of it needs to be stored. So the operational definition might be a useful one. There's also a conceptual definition. There's no real agreement in the literature, but by and large, it is believed that there are several components to working memory, and that the differences between individuals could actually be the result of different types of interaction. Some properties that could contribute to the differences in working memory capacity could be resource allocation. How do individuals allocate resources? Buffer size. How big is that buffer? How much can you store? And then also processing capacity, meaning how much can you process at any one point in time. Broadly speaking, those are the properties that make up what we call executive control, and that brings me back to what I said about the brain and the frontal lobe, where we believe executive functions are located. One aspect of working memory capacity that really stands out and that should interest us in simultaneous interpreting is the ability to control attention. And let me take that a little bit further, especially when competing demands are operating. The ability to control one's attention, the capability of controlling attention, is a very, very important determiner of an individual's performance on complex working memory tasks. And we proceed on the assumption that simultaneous interpreting is indeed a complex working memory task, at least to some extent. The next question that we would want to ask ourselves is, are we actually talking in simultaneous interpreting about attention sharing, or are we talking about controlling attention? We want to know whether simultaneous interpreting is possible because of good attention sharing between comprehension and production processes, or because individuals who are good at this are also very, very good at strategic attention switching. What do we have to do to really uncover what makes simultaneous interpreters tick. Is it more important for us to know how well they are able to store information? Or is it more important for us to know how well they process the information? Or do we really need to try and design experimental tasks that will allow us to tap into the so-called storage plus processing tasks? Because again, not all working memory tasks are created equal, and that brings me back to the contradictory results that I hinted at when I discussed the kind of research that's been carried out in working memory and simultaneous interpreting. Some of the experimental tasks that were used in those different experiments were not created equal. They did not tap into exactly the same parts of the brain, and hence the results cannot be compared and ultimately are not comparable. So, is simultaneous interpreting doing two or more things at once, or does it mean that we're actually pretty good at juggling, switching our attention, moving back and forth between one task and another? Another thing that we're keenly interested in when it comes to executive control is how the brain deals with speed. As we've seen before, speed is a major constraint in simultaneous interpreting. And if we go back to Kahneman, we can say that the amount of effort that is required to perform a task does not merely depend on the intrinsic characteristics of this task, but also by the rate at which this task is completed. And that also brings us back to the lack of comparability of some of the working memory experiment results that we have in simultaneous interpreting and available in the literature. The differences are not only due to differences in the task characteristics, but they're also, and I would say perhaps even mostly due to the fact that in many of these experiments, the tasks were not time constrained. Individuals had as much time as they wanted to in order to complete the task. If we look at another definition with respect to the speed of processing, we can say with Lepine that when performed at a high pace, even simple activities can involve a very large amount of effort, but during very short periods of time. And if we reiterate those tasks under time pressure, they become highly demanding. It does require continuous control of attention. And the more we bump up the speed, the more demanding the task becomes. So we do have some very good cognitive arguments for the constraints that we had listed up front. Speed, indeed, is a major constraint in simultaneous interpreting and is becoming an even more serious constraint as the length of conferences and the length of meetings being reduced. Speakers are saying as much, if not more, in less time, hence speak faster. We have rates at which originals are being presented that go almost above 180 words a minute. Ultimately, what that means for us in training is that we need to find ways, or we need to develop ways to train students how to deal with speeded performance. Speeded performance and that kind of training does require or hinges upon our brain being plastic, our brain being willing to change. That kind of change is quite possible, especially when we're younger. It becomes increasingly less possible as we age. So speeded performance and aging, or a higher age at which we acquire speeded performance does pose a serious constraint. But I would also like to add, and this refers very clearly to remote interpreting as well, that once we have acquired a skill and we've carried it out for quite some time using specific strategies, executing the tasks in particular ways, having found our groove, so to speak, makes it very difficult for us to change. It is not impossible. However, the earlier we introduce flexibility and adaptability into the task, the more we will be able to reap the benefits further down the road. Confronting an interpreter who's been in the profession for many, many, many years, who's become an expert in his or her field with an entirely new work environment, whether that's remote interpreting or highly speeded performance, does pose its problems. And that will ultimately lead me into the third part of my presentation, where I will be talking about how we can learn to circumvent certain constraints. So we know that many fundamental skills are relevant to simultaneous interpreting, and we've also found out that one of them is the control of attention. The skill is particularly important if switching one's attention from one subtask to another in simultaneous interpreting at just the right moments was an important aspect of interpreting. I believe it is. But what's even more difficult is that any task will become more difficult as time goes on. We talked about time on task. Vigilance is needed to stay on task. And some individuals may have difficulties staying on task, maintaining a high level of concentration for a very long time. We may even believe that some of these skills are inborn. Others believe that, indeed, they can be acquired. My perspective on the inborn versus acquisition paradigm is that, indeed, there are many, many different strategies that you can acquire in the course of becoming an interpreter. One of the most important ones, however, would be that there's no such thing as the strategy. There's no such thing as the solution. I think in many different training programs, that might be one of the capital sins. A trainer or tutor, in good faith, recommending to the trainee, this is the way I do it, this is the best way to do it. It may be the best way for the trainer, but it ignores entirely the very specific characteristics of the trainee's brain, and those may not match up with that of the trainer's brain. What I'm trying to say here is that in order for us to move with new technologies and to be able to adapt and to integrate them into our work environment, one of the most essential skills that we need to learn has actually nothing to do with simultaneous interpreting. It is the skill to adapt. Think of the brain paradigm. The brain is plastic. We need to be plastic. We need to be able to change. The brain changes, so why don't we change? We've got the potential, but are we using it? Are our trainers inviting us to use it? This is where research on experts and the development of expertise, the development of expert skills, is of fundamental importance to our understanding of simultaneous interpreting, the process, and how we're able to adapt to new circumstances. It would seem to me that throughout the history, rather short history, of simultaneous interpreting, we focused a lot on expertise, on developing a high level of performance, but we haven't really asked ourselves often enough whether that high level of performance can be maintained and sustained no matter what comes at us, or whether we are very good at doing what we do for as long as the work environment doesn't change. And I think a lot of the controversy that has arisen around the whole notion of remote interpreting and video interpreting has arisen because somebody changed something in our immediate environment, and we don't have the skill to adapt. We haven't been trained to adapt. We're not necessarily at a stage yet where we can put our finger on the kind of cognitive constraint that would be more or less amenable to being circumvented. But indeed, that would be a very promising avenue of research. And I believe now that we have medical imaging available to us, we can open the brain, we can open it up to inspection, although there are limits to that, and we can at least hope to find certain areas that would of which we know what part of the language processing they are responsible for, so that we can then create a connection between what we see on the scan and what we know theoretically happens during interpreting. Here are some of the parameters that affect the performance of novices and experts. There's speed, the lag, which requires a considerable amount of buffer memory, concentration, the ability to focus for a long time, but also selectively focus, picking out the right stream of information that's coming at you. Dual tasking, access to bilingual and multilingual lexicons, the recognition of discourse structures, etc. Concentration indeed emerges as one of the main constraints, especially for novices, but it continues to be important for experts as well. Interpreting students, in particular, have a very hard time concentrating on the task of simultaneous interpreting for longer than a few minutes in the beginning. As they begin to master the various sub-skills, they become increasingly able to sustain longer periods in the booth, and their endurance improves. But again, in a long-term study on attentional control, a qualitative study that I carried out on about 55 interpreting students, following them for about 6 months during their training, the ability to concentrate emerged as the primary constraint. It dwarfs all other constraints in interpreting. And I think that indeed provides important information, is an important input to how we ultimately read the quantitative data we're able to obtain through medical imaging. If we know that either switching attention rapidly or sustaining attention for a very long period of time is one of the cardinal problems in interpreting, especially for novices. We can imagine that even experts will have difficulties with it. I have not carried out a comparable study on experts, but hope one day I'll be able to do it, or perhaps somebody else will pick up the research question and run a parallel study that will inform us about how experts fare with concentration. Bearing that in mind, and assuming then that in order to be able to contend with new work environments and new constraints, one of the most important skills that a novice needs to acquire is actually being able to adapt to changing circumstances, being flexible. We now have to see how we can design learning environments that will help trainees acquire those skills, acquire that skill in particular. I'm going to show you just a few images of the complexity of such learning environments. It is clear that if you would like for a student to be able to not just learn the process of simultaneous interpreting, but to be able to carry out simultaneous interpreting tasks in a complex, high-tech environment, you're going to have to expose them to it. Now, compared to 15 years ago, that is not as challenging today as it used to be. Students who are now entering our training programs are already pretty good multitaskers. They're already driving and texting and carrying on a conversation at the same time. Now, while that may be against the law, for us as trainers, it is good news. Their ability to multitask, their ability to juggle different streams of information, both visual and auditory information, is indeed a considerable advantage for a training program that will have to train students to be able to contend with the many challenges of a technology-rich work environment. Here are just a few more images of what it takes to create such a learning environment and how we can simulate in the booth for those trainees what they will ultimately have to face in real life. We have multi-point video conferences where we put different training programs across Europe in a video conferenced masterclass, and students will be hearing a speaker from one town interpreting that speaker for an assessor who might be sitting in a different town. Now, on the surface, that may not seem all that difficult, but it is challenging in terms of technology that supports that type of work. As we all know, sound and image don't travel at the same rate. And when we carried out the first experiments in remote interpreting, we realized precisely that. The interpreters were unhappy because they couldn't see what they were hearing. Nowadays, we have software that slows down the sound so that ultimately it arrives at the listener's ear simultaneously with the image that he or she sees on the screen. Now, that might be easy on the surface again, but it required many, many different standards to be developed and many different tests to to be run before the technology was mature enough to be able to be used in an interpreting environment. And again, the more layers of technology you add, the more room there is for things to break down. And while normal, traditional interpreting installations are not entirely immune to breaking down, nevertheless, they're relatively robust compared to a modern video conferenced interpreting environment. And somehow, the ultimate user just cannot remain aware of all those layers. For the ultimate user, what counts is, I need reliable interpretation for this meeting or for this event, and I expect the technology to work. So we have expectations on the one hand that can be matched with the right technical tools and the right expertise on part of the interpreter. But yes, problems occur and systems are known to break down. If a simultaneous interpretation installation breaks down, the interpreter can always take a piece of paper and a pen and engage in consecutive interpreting. No installation needed for that. If the technology breaks down in a video conference meeting, it will spell the end of the meeting. So we can see that the more complex a work environment we create, the more opportunity there is for things to break down and the less chance there is to find a fallback solution. I think this is something that needs to be considered, and that users who, for whatever reason, are firm believers in technology quite often don't really expect to happen. Here are some more complex designs and setups. This one is taken from a class that we organized with Kobe College. We had a speaker on Japanese architecture, and it was interpreted from Japanese into English at Kobe College, and then we received the English stream, but we also received the Japanese stream here in Geneva. But the images had to scroll simultaneously with the speaker. So we created very complex design, and it did work very well. But these designs, I think, provide ample evidence of the fact that this is a very complex operation, and that the technology has to work and not just the brain. We can also provide virtual feedback. And again, introducing all these learning opportunities allows the student to come to terms with a new work environment, and perhaps that new work environment for him or her is not new. It is the work environment. It is what he or she would expect once they go out into the profession. Having developed strategies and having been able to adapt to different kinds of scenarios, being able to interpret simultaneously, irrespective of the various environments in which one is asked to work, would indeed be the hallmark of an adaptive expert, the kind of expert that we would like to train. The stress here is indeed on training. It is not necessarily on retraining, because increasingly we find that if you've been trained as a routine expert, it is very difficult to make you an adaptive expert. We've got to build the adaptation into the training program already for your brain to be able to perform no matter what the challenges are that are thrown at it. I'd like to mention a few other constraints or a few other characteristics that will help us better understand why simultaneous interpreting carried out in a remote setup can be very difficult indeed, and why already during training certain strategies have to be put in place. Simultaneous interpreting is a forward-looking task. Anticipation of what's going to come at us is vital at all levels, and that is important for the interpreter to know or to anticipate so that he or she can allocate resources appropriately. Consecutive interpreting, on the other hand, is in a way a backward-looking task. We're constantly confirming what we've heard. As we take our consecutive notes, we draw arrows from what we've heard to confirm what we're hearing at this point. What is it that we need to anticipate in simultaneous interpreting? We need to anticipate the intended meaning of the speaker without being able to wait for the end of the sentence. We need to anticipate what kind of effect the speaker would like to make on the audience. But all of that is taken away from the interpreter when he or she works in a relay or in a remote mode, because something has come in between. He doesn't see the room. There is a delay between the original and the interpretation already. It doesn't see the audience. So there are many things that have been taken away. For the interpreter to be able to engage in anticipation despite the fact that he doesn't have all the clues available to him is indeed what needs to be recognized at the learning stage already. There are many different elements that go into creating meaning, from cultural schemata to genres to what the audience or how the audience is responding. All of these allow us to listen actively, not just to what we hear, but also to see, to use clues, extra-linguistic clues. Delegates nodding their heads, delegates repeating the interpreter's wording, delegates acting on the interpreter's output. All of these feedback processes take place on a moment-by-moment basis, and they're crucial to the fast-paced flow of simultaneous interpreting. Certain types of information can indeed be substituted across different media. Yes, we can have a close-up of the speaker, and then perhaps we can have a picture-in-picture of the audience as well. That would allow us to see how heads are turning. It will allow us to capture visual or non-visual clues. But removing the visual channel does change the outcome of the simultaneous interpreting task, because we cannot substitute in real time for non-visual clues. In a meta-analysis that I carried out of the various parameters that influence the feeling of presence, as we call this, we can see that, in a way, the view of the speaker is the least of the problems. The view of the conference room, however, is. And not having these clues available makes a big difference in the work of interpreters who are not used to new work environments, who are not adaptive experts. In this case, I can compare the scores in an experiment where the same interpreters were being analyzed working live and working remotely. And we can see that in terms of meaning, in the remote location, there is a very significant difference between the quality and the meaning that they are able to capture in the original of those who work live and those who work remotely, particularly when it comes to the end of a turn. If we look at the parameters that affect remote interpreting the most, and we do a meta-analysis of the various experiments that have been carried out, we can see that the view of the speaker is the least problematic. As a matter of fact, the view of the speaker is even better in a remote setting than it is in a live setting. But we can see that below the zero line, so to speak, the view of the conference room is a real issue. The alienation from the conference room is an issue. And ultimately, the motivation that the interpreter has to really get the message across. So what is the outlook? I think remote interpreting is here to stay. Many technical challenges have been overcome. We've got the H320 standard for video conferencing over digital networks. We have the H264 SVC for IP video transmission over the public internet. We also know, and we've seen that in our research, that cognitive constraints can be partially overcome through training. We've seen that the brain is plastic. But I think the real message is remote interpreting requires adaptive expertise. And this is where we, as trainers, are being challenged. We need to find training paradigms that will allow us to train interpreters as adaptive experts. Because it may be remote interpreting today. It might be something else tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.